Once again, we would like to say thank you very much to all of our attendees for taking the time out to attend this Toolbox Talk this morning. To get started, obviously, the tips to continually prevent COVID-19. We hope that all of you who managed to make the plumber's evening, you obviously enjoyed it very much. We saw a lot of posts, a lot of pictures, and also a lot of comments from a lot of you sending it through to us on how much you actually enjoyed that. So thank you very much for joining. And we also want to say again, thank you very much for taking the time out to look at how you can prevent COVID-19 in your workplace. Obviously, we've spoken about this before, and risk assessments must still be in place to try and prevent any occupational illness that includes COVID-19 at the moment. So these same tips or the same protocols that came out when the pandemic hit us: washing your hands, using sanitizer, avoid touching your eyes, nose, and mouth with unwashed hands, social distancing or avoiding close contact with those who are sick, covering your cough and sneeze, as well as cleaning and disinfecting frequently touched objects and surfaces is all still in place. And then every company must make a decision as well as a policy based on what they will do for vaccination. Now, we know many of you are getting vaccinated purely because your clients state that you need to have a vaccination card before you arrive on site. Yes, that is legally required from their side, and it is still a decision that you can make within your company. You also will still see people wearing masks at certain places. This is not because they're being pedantic, but it is based on their risk assessment, because the amount of people that they deal with, and also because COVID is not completely eradicated at this stage. So based on our risk assessments, we must then institute stricter measures, or perhaps we can forego certain things based on our risk assessment as well. Please remember that your clients may supersede what you require. So if they do want you to be vaccinated, it is a requirement and they can legally ask for that. So we just want to remind you of that. We don't want to fight with our clients, but they are allowed to ask you to have your employees vaccinated. Now, coming up for our Toolbox Talks for this month, obviously for August, today we're going to look at confined spaces and the 7 risks that we'll have within a confined space. Next week is a public holiday, so we will not be having a Toolbox Talk next week, Tuesday. But then we're going to be looking at heights, electrical, water, and then our hot works or fire, combustibles, anything that we might be working in terms of hot works. That risk will then just move over to next month's Toolbox Talk. The safety thought, we thought we would mention this because confined space is something that can change very quickly. And so measure twice, cut once is something that many of us already know. It's something that we grew up with, perhaps something that we've been taught by our parents, our grandfathers, who said that if you measure it twice and you cut once, you'll have a lot more accuracy. And that is because you don't ever want to cut something and then find out later that it isn't the correct length. Now, with confined spaces and the differences that you will find, or the different dangers that you'll find in a confined space, we're going to suggest the same safety measures. Before entering into a confined space or before deciding to work in any confined space, we would like to ask you to please check and then check again before entering that confined space. This is because things change, and also because of the various types of dangers that you're going to find. Now, just for those of you who might not have worked in a confined space before, or those of you who've been working in a very long time, here's a reminder: what is a confined space? Well, confined space is an enclosed area where there is a risk of death or dangerous injury, first of all because of dangerous substances or because of dangerous conditions that exist within that confined space. Now, enclosures with limited openings, such as drains, sewers, tanks, silos, are termed confined spaces. And obviously your clients will request that you have a task-specific risk assessment for it, perhaps confined space permanent entry, as well as confined space training for all of your staff. Now, these are often places that are not usually entered by people. So if you think of silos and tanks and sewers, yes, people are often in them, fixing and maintaining them, but it's not a normal traffic area. It's not a normal area of work. This is because it's normally used for maintenance or inspections. So it's not like an office area that only has one door entering in or entering out. That's not what we would term a confined space. That's just a small office or a cramped area or a small space, vastly different to what we would term a confined space. Now, during most construction work, some areas may become confined spaces due to the work being carried out. So we might be on a construction site and working, and all of a sudden the trench becomes a confined space due to the nature and dangers within that trench. Unventilated rooms or building voids could also become confined spaces, but this is generally when construction is being undertaken, purely because of the type of work or the type of danger that we're going to find there. So let us just take a look at the 7 dangers that can arise out of confined spaces for you as plumbers. And then we also want to discuss what it is, and then you take a look at what you could do to perhaps prevent this. Now, again, as we've mentioned all the time, we want to design safe working procedures, risk assessments, as well as method statements for how you should go about working in a particular confined space. Almost all confined spaces are going to be different. We never know the type of work that you're going to be working in, the atmosphere that you're going to find in it, or even the weather and site conditions that you might find around a confined space. But the more information we receive from you in the types of confined spaces that you're finding, the types of safe working procedures you're performing within that confined space, we can then give this information to the rest of the plumbers out there in normal templates. And these templates will be in the form of daily safe task instructions, hot works permits, confined space permits, working at heights permits, all things that are fairly generic that we try and cover as many risks and hazards as possible, but just to give you a starting point, something that will allow you to not only understand what you're going to be facing, but it gives you a starting point to be able to design a better management system for yourself. So please keep those emails coming through, those questions coming through. We're getting quite a lot every week, and we're sorry that we do take quite a while to get back to you sometimes. Sometimes it's over a week or even 2 weeks that we get back to all of the emails that we are finding, but please don't let that deter you. We will still get back to you. If you've sent us a mail, we are definitely getting to your mail. So we just want to say thank you very much for the amazing response that we have been receiving. Now, the first type of confined space risk that we are going to find is a lack of oxygen. Now, oxygen can be removed from the atmosphere within a confined space through naturally occurring reactions. So this is not something that you've done or that it's man-made. It's just a natural thing. This could be the reaction between certain soils and the oxygen around it through groundwater, chalk, limestone. These can all produce different types of dangers, specifically looking at carbon dioxide, which displaces oxygen. And then the oxygen in the atmosphere, because it's displaced, is lessened in that working environment. Even rust inside a confined space, like inside a tank, can create a lack of oxygen, because that rust forming will then minimize the amount of oxygen that is in that environment. That is why many times when we walk into a confined space or decide to work in a confined space, there's a lot of checks that have to be done. One of the checks is how much oxygen there is in that environment in order to ensure that employees can enter in there without specific respirators that need to be worn. But if there is a lack of oxygen, then obviously we need to determine the specific type of respirator that will be needed. Now, that is not just determining the amount of oxygen that's in there. It will also be determining the other types of vapors, gases, etc., that might also build up in that environment. And then, is the respirator that you're using able to take out those particles or able to make sure that you are not inhaling any of those dangerous substances? So with a lack of oxygen, obviously we want to always make sure that we pump oxygen into that confined space. We never want to try and suck out dangerous atmospheres or dangerous substances within that confined space. If you have a lack of oxygen or an oxygen deficient environment, you always want to try and pump fresh oxygen into that environment. Now, you can either do that obviously by using a breathing apparatus, that is a self-breathing apparatus with an oxygen tank that is connected to your mask, or you can just have massive fans that are blowing from the outside through specific types of ventilation systems into that environment. Now, depending on the type of work, the amount of time, all of that might be different. But an oxygen deficient atmosphere is anything below 20.9%. That is when it starts becoming oxygen deficient, because 20.9% or 21% oxygen in our atmosphere is what we call normal fresh air. So anything below that, you start having oxygen deficiency. Now, when it's 19.5 to 20.9, this is an acceptable low oxygen atmosphere. In other words, according to occupational health and safety, we will still allow certain works to take place within that environment. Now, we're not saying that that entire environment is suitable completely for any works. We still need to see the type of work that is going to be performed in there, because you might be welding, you might be working with hazardous chemical substances, you might be digging, you might be working with piping, and all of those will create additional risks and hazards. So although the person is allowed to work in that environment for a certain period of time, ensuring that they have the necessary safety protocols in place, there may still be restrictions on other types of work, and that all depends on the type of environment that you're in. Then when we get down below 19.5%, so this is anything between 10 and 19.5, you will have increased breathing rate because you are trying to pull in oxygen from the surrounding area. You will have an accelerated heartbeat. You will have impaired thinking and coordination. So anything below 19.5, between 10 and 19.5, you're not going to be in the best, how can we put it, reactive state. In other words, you're going to slow down. Your coordination will not be as good as in a normal fresh air environment. Now, if we get below that, you start vomiting, you'll get lethargy, which means you can't walk, you can't stand, you're going to be very lazy. This could lead to unconsciousness as well. And then obviously anything from 6% and below, you will have convulsions, you will stop breathing, and you could go into cardiac arrest, which basically is heart attack, and then you will pass away. Now, this happens in such a short period of time that many have gone into a confined space and passed out, and then try to be rescued by someone else. And then that person that runs into rescue without the correct procedures, rescue equipment, they then are overcome by an oxygen deficient atmosphere. They get knocked unconscious, or even just lose coordination. They get impaired thinking, so they're not too sure what's going on around them. That eventually succumbs them to the oxygen deficient atmosphere, and they pass away. Now, that has happened in many, many case studies. In fact, we've spoken about it last year as well on a few case studies that we found with rescue attempts that had been undertaken where one person had fallen asleep inside it, or was unconscious inside an oxygen deficient atmosphere, and another 2 workers went in. Those 2 workers passed away, and another 2 workers went in to save them, and those 2 workers passed away. That means 5 people passed away in just one account, purely because they weren't prepared for that emergency situation. So as we mentioned earlier, gases, fumes, and vapors can also be present in a confined space. And because we don't know what is in that confined space, it could be poisonous gases. And all of this could build up in that confined space, especially where there is a lack of ventilation. So deadly gases can obviously leak into the confined space through burst gas pipes, contaminated land. Now, you as plumbers are constantly working with broken pipes or blocked pipes. And when you need to enter into that confined space, we are not sure what the condition of those pipes are. That's the whole reason why you're being called out to go and take a look. Is it blocked? Is it damaged? Does it need to be replaced? Once you've done your inspection, that is also dangerous. Now, this is just something that we want to take a sideline on. For many plumbers, they feel that it's safe if they're doing an inspection. So you're going out to quote on work. You're not doing the physical work. And some of you have sent us emails saying, why would my client request a safety file for an inspection to be done? Well, you do need to understand that even though you are only inspecting that confined space or that crawl area or that void where the work needs to be taken or undertaken, and you're just going to go and inspect to see what needs to be done so that you can quote, you are still putting a person into that area. That area still has the same risks and hazards. Yes, they are accumulated when you have additional work that needs to be done and you have your own risks and hazards that you add to that environment, but that environment is still dangerous. And even though you're not performing any specific physical work, you are still physically in that environment. And so your clients want to know how you are going to mitigate those risks safely. In other words, get in and get out in the safest means possible. Now, some clients are pedantic. They want a full safety file where once we've spoken to the safety officer, we get away with just doing a RAMS, that is a risk assessment and method statement, which is your two most important documents for doing certain inspections. And this is why we explain to our plumbers, just speak to your client and see if you can give them those two documentations to find out how you are going to do the inspection properly. Give them a method statement. What are the risks and hazards that you find in that environment? And what are the safe working procedures for you? And 100% of the clients that we've spoken to have all agreed that those two documents is what is necessary. So far, we have been able to alleviate a lot of cost when it comes to just doing the inspections. But cost does not outweigh the amount of danger that some plumbers put themselves in purely because they don't want to spend the money making sure that it is safe. So please do not create hazardous environments for yourself thinking it's safe to go in just because you're inspecting. So you can also have dangerous gases, fumes, and vapors created by work being carried out in that environment. So if you're going to weld, if you're going to use adhesives or any paint fumes, this could also increase the gases, fumes, and vapor hazards within a confined space. And for plumbers, if you're going to be soldering or if you're going to be working with PVC weld in that confined space, because there's not sufficient ventilation, the fumes that will build up with that PVC weld could engulf the person and then allow them to pass out in that area. Now, without extraction or ventilation in this environment, it can build up to become very, very dangerous, as well as displace the oxygen. And then we lead back to the first risk, where we have lack of oxygen in an environment. Flooding and engulfment is our third risk. Now, liquids, especially with plumbers, working with water or any type of sewage, can quickly flood the confined space, particularly in drainage or sewer work. Trapping and potential drowning within those areas are very common. Now, it's not just liquids that we worry about. Obviously, solids can also flood a confined space. And when we talk about solids, we are talking about collapsing of trenches or anything within an excavation where the actual solid soil, rocks, or debris around you can then, instead of what we call flooding, we call engulfment of a person. And that can pack on top of a person and trap them underneath that soil. So confined spaces can be small, which means flooding can occur in a matter of seconds, leaving no time to escape. Now, we're not just saying this because we think it could happen. We're saying this because it has happened before. In fact, we just try and remember some of the floods that occurred just recently in our past year out in the KZN area, as well as the Limpopo area, where due to a lot of rain, a lot of excavations and trenches were quickly flooded. And we remember those children that passed away because they were playing on a construction site, because they were allowed access to it. There wasn't correct, proper access control in and around that area, and they died because of the flooding that occurred there. Within a matter of seconds, they were already washed away. So flooding can occur because confined spaces are very small. The fourth risk that we want to look at is dust. Now, dust can again be natural, or it can be through a specific activity that is undertaken. So wind can cause dust, storms can cause dust, anything around us within the working environment can quickly become a dusty environment, but also the work you perform or the work other contractors perform around you can also create a dusty environment. Now, again, we're talking about inside a confined space. So if you're inside a confined space and perhaps now you need to knock out a piece of the wall or core drill a certain area because you need to access piping, well, then drilling or grinding within that area, because it's a confined space, could build up an amount of dust in that area that could also become excessive to the point where you are inhaling this dust and you can cause serious health issues. So respiratory problems and hazardous dust, depending on what you're drilling into, what you're grinding into. If you're not too sure what you're drilling into or grinding into, it could be an old building that has asbestos, and this could become a hazardous dust that can become fatal to yourself. Dust buildup can also increase fire and explosion risk, especially where there is a lack of ventilation. So if there's a lack of ventilation in that area, the dust that you're building up in that area could create a fire or explosion. Now, aside from just the ventilation point of it, you will not be able to see in that environment either. And so the risks and hazards that you might have in and around the working environment before you started working will become even more dangerous because of the dust that has filled that confined space, which now prevents you from being able to see or even walk correctly in and out of that confined space. The fifth danger is your fire and explosions. Now, this could be flammable vapors like your PVC weld that you are working with in there, any flammable liquids, flammable gases, and dust, as we mentioned, within that confined space can also increase the risk of fire and explosions. Now, the risk is further increased. So if you are performing any hot work or you're using any tool which can create a spark, grinders, drills, hot work such as soldering or welding, all of that will increase the likelihood of fire and explosions. That is why some of your clients will request not just a confined space permit, but on top of that, a hot works permit as well that supports the documentation of your confined space permit. Remember, a lack of oxygen was number one in our list. So if you have too much oxygen, that is also bad because fire thrives on oxygen. So if you have excessive oxygen levels, this can also increase the risk of fire and explosions. Now, we mentioned earlier, measure twice, cut once. That is because the working environment inside a confined space can change at any time. So we encourage you to please check and then check again. Now, our second last risk within a confined space is temperature. Because you're going to be working in that environment, sometimes it's often strenuous work that is performed or hot works, or even naturally occurring hot conditions, such as some of our summers here in South Africa, can lead to very dangerous increase in body temperature. Now, this can quickly become a problem within a confined space because it's difficult to escape them. And oftentimes we don't have correct ventilation in these areas. So we are not keeping the body cool. If this does occur, heat can rapidly rise due to the enclosed nature of the confined space. This can lead to things like heat stroke, exhaustion, as well as collapsing of the person. And if they do faint or become unconscious in that area, there is a high possibility that they could perish in that environment purely because of the high temperatures that you can find in confined spaces. That is why sometimes we walk into a confined space and it's a lot more humid than the normal working environment outside of that confined space. So please remember this, because the temperature that you feel when you walk in could quickly become dangerous because of the amount of work or strenuous work that you're going to perform in that confined space. Now, the last risk that we have or hazard that we will face within a confined space is restrictions of access. Now, confined space can be dangerous because they are difficult to get into and get out of. This means that if you do need to escape because of an emergency, it can be difficult, and it could also hinder an emergency rescue of somebody trapped in a confined space. So it's very important. Once you are inside a confined space, you may not be able to have a quick exit or quick entrance into that environment. So it's very important on all of your risk assessments, as well as your method statements, to know what work can be carried out safely before you get into that working environment, and always make sure that you have emergency arrangements in place. How are you going to actually get that person out of that confined space? By getting somebody in there safely and then back out safely. This means you might need to have specific rescue kits, as you see in the picture on the left-hand side. It may mean that you need to have a rescue team on hand, perhaps even on the site that you're working in. Some of this might seem a bit overwhelming for many of us, but remember, it makes sense depending on the type of risk that we are going to face, especially the type of risks and hazards that you might have on your site. So as we mentioned, next week, we will not be having a Toolbox Talk as it is a public holiday. So we hope you enjoy your long weekend if you're going to take Monday off. But our safety thought once again for this week is to measure twice, cut once with any safety aspect. Before doing or performing any work, especially in a confined space, please check and then check again before performing that work. Then we look forward to seeing you after that on the 16th for our next Toolbox Talk, where we also again look at risk with working at heights, the risk of electrical, and then the risk of water, specifically for you plumbers out there, always working in water environments. So again, thank you very much, and we'll hand it over back to you, Karim.
Thank you very much, Chris, for this informative session. We do have a comment from Theo that relates to the combination of hazards within a confined space. So the comment is, morning, Chris. Climbing up into a roof space is a hazard from all the dust stirred up in conjunction with the heat trapped in the airspace, especially where the hot water cylinder is far from the trapdoor.
100%, Theo. I would 100% agree with you on that. And in fact, a lot of plumbers do not take that into consideration when entering into a roof space. So perhaps what we can do is we'll design a little safe working procedure for accessing roof spaces. And maybe you can just send me a little bit more information that way so that we can send out not a Toolbox Talk, but perhaps just a safety notification to all of our plumbers, just reminding them of some of these risks that they will face when entering a roof space. So thank you very much for that comment. And again, we appreciate all the comments and emails that we receive from you.